My computer fine? Okay, thank you for coming today. Before I forget, those of you who are online, Heidi a little while ago emailed out a PDF document that contains several sheets, some of which we're going to go over today, and then toward the back of that document are a few fact sheets on what the new investment tax credit looks like. So what we're going to talk about today, we're going to kind of start off with a broad general overview of what solar looks like for a nonprofit organization. I think some of us coming into this kind of have no understanding of what solar costs, what it looks like. So we're going to kind of just look through a hypothetical example of a nonprofit here in town that we did some work for, and then just kind of give you some info on the solar size that we came up for that organization, and then what the financing for that might look like with the new investment tax credit as part of the IRA that passed last year. Then we're going to talk about direct ownership versus the traditional means of financing solar for non-taxable entities, which was the power purchase agreement. Amy Buska here was kind enough to present on the outlines of what a PPA looks like. So Amy will talk with us in a little bit about that. And then finally, we're going to talk about what the investment tax credit looks like. It's a 30% base tax credit, and then there are a few riders or adders that could potentially be added to that tax credit, depending on your organization's situation. And then finally, we're going to very briefly touch on the commercial clean vehicle tax credit, which is also a provision of the IRA, which is essentially a $7,500 tax credit for electric vehicle purchases. So just to start off with, it's great having so many people here. I think we have about 15 or 20 online, and then a good amount here in the room. Whether you're coming from a school district, a local or regional government, a church, a nonprofit organization, a rural electric co-op, there's potential for you here in these tax credits. So it's great to have everyone here. So to start off with some of the basics of solar before we get going. So a few general concepts for solar, if you're not familiar with what solar looks like. The first general concept is the idea of net metering. Net metering is essentially the ability to hook your solar system up to the grid, and depending on whether you're using electricity or not using electricity, are we good? That one? Yeah. Excellent. Is that better? Okay, good. So net metering is essentially the ability to connect your solar array to the grid. Essentially, when you produce electricity, you're going to consume some of it at the time at which it's produced. You're going to then be able to export that power back out onto the grid. And in the process of exporting that power back onto the grid, you're going to essentially receive credit for the power you produced. And then at a later point, whether that be at night when you're not producing electricity or in the winter months when you're not producing solar electricity, you're able to then take power back from the grid and essentially draw down those credits that you built up when you produce the electricity. Solar becomes economical with net metering. That's an integral component to making solar economical. The second issue is sizing of solar. So if you take that general concept of net metering, you can't just turn your solar array into a cash register. You're essentially sizing your solar array to essentially what your historic electric consumption or your historic electric usage is. It varies by utility, but generally speaking, you can size your system to about 100% of what your past electric usage is. So if I consumed 100,000 kilowatt hours of electricity last year, I could in theory size my system such that it's going to produce 100,000 kilowatt hours of power for the period going forward. So net metering, sizing. The other concept here, at least in the state of Iowa, is that solar arrays have to be tied to specific meters. So if you're a large organization, you may have a dozen meters. I'm working with Winneshiek County right now, and they have over 100 meters. So when you size your solar system, you have to pair it with, physically, it has to be paired with a meter. So that makes it kind of complicated. If you've got a whole dozen different meters dispersed in a geographic area, you're going to essentially have to pick the meter that makes the most sense, that has the usage associated with it, and physically build out your array in proximity to that meter. That's a constraint you have to take into account. And finally, the last consideration you might want to consider before installing solar is to do all the efficiency measures that you can prior to installing solar. Because if you look at the cost of solar versus the cost of efficiency improvements, oftentimes those efficiency improvements tend to be cheaper and tend to have shorter payback periods than does solar. So for example, incandescent to LED light conversions, depending on what the equipment is, but you may have a payback as short of 2 years. So you make an upfront investment. The efficiency is essentially recoup your investment over a period as short as 2 years. Another example might be, for example, an electric resistance hot water heater. So if you were to convert from an electric resistance hot water heater to an electric hybrid heat pump water heater, that new water heater is going to use about a third of the electricity that the electric resistance water heater does. So if you swap out that water heater and lower your electric consumption, the process of doing that is going to provide more payback opportunity for you, because those efficiency improvements tend to be cheaper than does solar. So making the efficiency investments beforehand, before you size your solar system, is something you really want to take into account, especially if those improvements have short payback periods. Yes, Andy. Yeah, thank you. So, Andy, yes, thanks. Andy's comment was essentially that if you oversize your solar relative to your production at the end of the year, so essentially once you, or at least in Alliant territory, once you hit the 1st of April every year, if you've accumulated so many credits and you've not burned through those credits by the 1st of April, they're not going to cut you a check for what remains in your account. That account simply goes back to zero. So there's no incentive to overproduce. So you as an organization, if you install your solar and then down the line do all these efficiency improvements, which lowers your consumption, you're essentially going to lose that production every year. So there's no incentive to oversize your system. Thank you, Andy. Now, looking at a not hypothetical organization here in Decorah. So just to present the situation here. So their facility, it's essentially a 13,300 square foot facility. It's an office building. It's an old building that houses about 30 employees who are, it's an office situation. About 30 employees. The building is used Monday through Friday. It's heated with gas in the winter, and then summer months, lots of air conditioning use. We had an energy audit done for them, or they had an energy audit done. Through that energy audit, they identified about $7,600 of LED lighting upgrades, which they moved forward with. They also spent $3,000 to replace an electric resistance water heater and replace that with a heat pump water heater. So they made about $10,000 in efficiency improvements up front. Both of these improvement projects had a payback period of about 4 years, thereabouts. So if you look at their electric usage prior to making those improvements, they were sitting at about $912 a month. After those improvements, they were able to lower their monthly electric bill to about $760, we estimated. So what does solar look like for them then? To offset all of their electric consumption, they needed a solar array that was 40.75 kilowatts in size, which size-wise is about 100 panels, depending on how big the panels are. About 100 panel array, which cost them $91,700 to do that. So they were able to offset all of their electricity for about $92,000. With the new 30% investment tax credit, essentially at tax time, they're going to receive a payment of 30% of the total project cost back to them. So after you take into account the tax credit, the cost to them upfront to install that solar was about $64,200. Now, it varies by market. Our solar install costs tend to be pretty low here, generally speaking, compared to other markets. Our electric rates tend to be pretty high compared to other markets. So as a result of having low prices, low install costs, and relatively high per kilowatt hour energy costs, our payback period tends to be pretty short in this territory that we're in here. So if you were to look at this system, very top level, their payback period with the 30% investment tax credit was about 7 years. So they're going to recoup all their money after about 7 years. The payback with the investment tax credit, if they were to finance that, now your terms of finance are going to vary by whatever institution you're using. But just throwing out the number of 7.5% interest over the course of 12 years, their payback period financing that project would be about 10.5 years for that project to pay for itself. If you were to look on the project on a 25-year lifespan, so most of the equipment is going to be warranted for 25 years. Your panels are going to have a 25-year warranty. Your inverters may not have a 25-year warranty. But assuming that we don't have any maintenance costs of the project over that 25-year lifetime horizon, we anticipate that that system is going to produce about $289,000 of electricity over 25 years. And then if you simply take this 289,000, subtract their initial investment of 64,000, you can see over the course of 25 years, they're going to have essentially a savings of about $225,000 versus not installing solar. A pretty compelling payback. Yeah. Utility rebates. Yes. Yep. So there was a water heater. Yes, both projects do. Yep. And if you look at your packet here on the back of the second page, we're not going to go over this, but this is essentially the cost breakdown. We have an annual cash flow of the project and then a cumulative cash flow. You can see what the project does over the course of 25 years. You'll notice on the second column here, it says energy production, and then it says 0.6 degradation, 0.6% degradation. Over every year, you're going to see a loss of about 0.6% in production. And then for this analysis here, we assumed an energy inflation cost of about 3% annually, year over year. Now, some of the basics of direct ownership. So like I said at the very beginning, historically for non-taxable entities, kind of your entry into solar was through a power purchase agreement. Now with the investment tax credit that you're able to capture yourself, there are some advantages to doing that. So kind of the basics of what direct ownership of a solar system looks like. So for tax exempt organization like 501c, so whether you're a 501c3, they're different categories under the IRS, they should all be eligible under direct pay. School districts, state, local, and tribal governments, and rural electric cooperatives, you're now able to receive that 30% reimbursement of the value of the tax credit at tax time. So that's another thing to consider when you're thinking about this type of project. You're going to have to upfront the full project cost, and then it may be a year or a year and a half until you actually receive that check back, that 30% back. So if I were to complete my project in January, let's say, I'm not going to file my taxes until I'm not filing taxes, but I'd submit the form, we think, the following spring at tax time, and then it may be several months. So it may be a year and a half until you're able to recoup that 30% back. So you're able to receive the 30% tax credit. The process is relatively straightforward. This is kind of appealing, especially to small organizations, I think. I was involved with a local house museum here 4 or 5 years ago. We put solar on. We installed a 5 kilowatt array. It was only like a $14,000 project. We investigated a PPA, but the more we looked into it, we kind of felt like it was over the tops of our heads. We didn't really understand what it was. There are some potential legal costs associated with establishing a PPA arrangement. We ended up just seeking our donors to fund the project, and that's how we paid for it. We didn't pursue the PPA. But given the fact it's a relatively straightforward process where you find a contractor, you build out the system, you file documentation with the IRS and receive your tax credit, it's relatively straightforward for small nonprofits and for simple projects. A simple and straightforward payback depending on your electric provider, but essentially for most customers in the Alliant territory, it's going to be about 7 years. And then for My Energy customers, you're looking at a payback of potentially about 10 years because My Energy customers' rates tend to be a tiny bit lower. Below that, it says works great for organizations that can fund projects up front. Financing can lengthen the project or the payback period significantly, depending on what interest rate you're financing your project at. Another point here to note is for school districts, there can be kind of a de facto budget barrier between your capital expenses and your operational expenses. So if you can invest in solar as a capital expense, that may potentially free up your operating costs to give you some flexibility in your budgeting process every year. So installing solar for school districts oftentimes makes sense because you can do that on the capital expense side of things, and then essentially take your energy costs or your electricity energy costs out of the mix of your operational budget portion every year. So that can be an advantage to think about. And then finally on here, it says for large commercial users, subject to demand charges and low per kilowatt hour energy rates, solar might not make sense with the ITC. What do I mean by that? So large customers, so think of a hospital, a factory, a water treatment facility, sewage plant, dairies, like any big user. You might be over a certain usage threshold where you're subject to what we call demand charges. If you look at how the rate structure is set up for that type of user, essentially your energy charge, your per kilowatt hour energy charge tends to be really, really low, on the order of, let's say, 4 cents, versus if I were a small commercial user, my energy costs may be 16 cents. So I'm paying 4 cents versus 16, but I'm then also subject to what we call demand charges, which are calculated from your peak usage occurrences over your previous billing cycle. So those demand charges may be $9 or $10 a kilowatt hour. So if you look at meters that have demand charges associated with them, the energy charge on those meters tends to be really, really low. And if you pair solar with those meters, the value of that solar is also going to be really, really low. So if you're a large customer subject to demand charges, sticking solar on that type of a meter may not make sense for you because you're going to significantly draw out the payback period and reduce the value of what that solar is. Yes. Yes. Yep. Amy said a caveat to that would be that if you're kind of at that threshold of being potentially subject to demand charges or not being subject to demand charges, if you're able to either install battery storage or use the energy produced to lower that threshold, which is, I worked with a My Energy customer and that's what they were able to do. They essentially offset almost all of their usage on that account, and they went from being subject to demand charges to then not being subject to demand charges, making the value of the solar worth more essentially than if it were just a meter subject to demand charges. So you can use solar or potentially use battery storage to kind of get below that threshold of your usage threshold to not be subject to demand charges. Yes. Yes. So for where do you start? Okay. Okay. So Amy's going to present now a few slides on power purchase agreements, and then after Amy's done, we're going to talk about some specifically what the IRA incentives look like. And Amy, you can take it. Okay, so this one goes in your right here. And then,
oh, I hate that. I suppose everybody heard me say that. Is the camera okay now? Okay. Thank you. So Paul asked me to come in and talk a little about power purchase agreements. And the reason he asked me is because I'm on the city council at Cresco, and we were one of the first power purchase agreements in Iowa after they were legalized in 2015. We signed in early 2016, and we've had a great experience. Now, what I would say is I recently have become aware of some entities that have power purchase agreements that say they did not have a great experience. I think it might depend on who your investor is. So let's talk about what an investor is and what are they doing here. So a power purchase agreement is a contract, and it's circled in red here, between a non-taxpayer and a for-profit entity, which I've labeled with great imagination, limited liability corporation. The limited liability corporation is backed by an investor. The investor puts in money, which is going to buy the solar system, and gets back money and tax credits. The actual contract, let's look at the next one. The major components of this contract are the agreement of the LLC to install and maintain the solar system for the term of the contract. So they're putting in our case, it was about $768,000. We have 350 kilowatts of solar at 7 different sites. Unfortunately, as we were just talking about, which I think some of the online people did not hear, is we would love to put it at our sewer plant and our fitness center, but they're subject to demand charges. And I've been watching for 7 years now, and I cannot make the finances work. Paul, remind me to come back to community-sided solar, which might help some cities. The second part of the PPA is an agreement of the non-taxpayer to purchase all of the power produced. Let me emphasize the LLC here, the owner of the solar, is not a utility. They're not selling you what you need. They're selling you everything that they produce, whether you need it or not. So what Paul said about doing efficiency first is in spades if you're in a power purchase agreement. We had one department that swore to me that they were never, ever going to replace a certain entity, which I'm not going to say what it was. And then about 3 years later, they replaced them. And now they've got a really big net metering account. We're grandfathered into a net metering agreement that no longer exists. Otherwise, we would have lost it. I almost lost it when I noticed it. The third part is the right of the non-taxpayer to, and I'm using bond notation here, to call the contract and negotiate to purchase the system once the tax benefits are finished. For reasons which I do not understand, the IRS says you cannot set the buyout price in advance. Somehow this turns it into some kind of weird other tax situation. That used to be, depending on your tax filing and when everything was done, this used to be, it's 6 or 7 years. You can now get accelerated depreciation. So if you're the taxpayer here, this could be as early as 2 years. And when we signed it, the terms of the contracts were almost all 25 years. Now I've heard, I haven't seen one, that they can be as short as 10 and maybe even shorter than that. But you retain the right to call the contract. That doesn't mean you have to do it. It doesn't mean they have to sell it to you. It's the right to negotiate. From what I understand, most investors don't want to be an electric provider for 25 years. So there is some incentive on both sides to do this. And the final really important piece is the agreement of the LLC to remove the solar if the contract isn't bought out once the contract ends. Otherwise, you're left with a bunch of solar there, taking up land. So what a contract looks like, 47 pages. But don't worry, the guts only take up 30 pages. The rest of it is addenda. And there's a lot of party of the first part talking to the party of the second part, but this is really the guts of it. But where the gains are, why are people doing this? To the non-taxpayer, you purchase power at below utility rates. We are currently paying 11.1 or something like that cents per kilowatt hour. Whereas with Alliant, depending on the time of the year, it would be 15-ish cents per kilowatt hour. Then, assuming we negotiate an agreeable price, we will buy the system at less than the original cost. And afterwards, we're just like any other solar owner. We're paying 0 cents per kilowatt hour for our electricity, although now we have to pay the insurance and the maintenance, which those do change. And there are maintenance issues. You'd be amazed what kids with slingshots and lead sinker weights can do. The investor, why are they in this? And by the way, most installers who know how to do this will bring you an investor unless it's a huge project. For a normal nonprofit sized project, they'll bring you an investor. They have them, kind of a library of them. The investor gets monthly income until the buyout, gets the 30% tax credit right up front, has tax losses. Now I know that sounds terrible because they're depreciating the system as soon as you say losses, but tax losses reduce your taxes. So tax losses are good. and then they receive a payment for the buyout. And in extremely round terms, if you're thinking of being an investor, you get, these are roughly equal. That's not, and I know Larry Grimstad is on here because I saw his name come up. This is not exactly equal. Some of these are like 32% and 21%, and it depends on all sorts of stuff. But in round numbers, they need all four of these. Why are we not moving forward? Just a second, we're not. Well, while Paul is trying to get the computer to wake up again, there we go. Thank you. Power purchase agreement versus direct ownership. Everyone thought, as did I, that as soon as this direct ownership with the refundable tax credit came online, that power purchase agreements were dead. I do not believe that's the case. Having run a bunch of stuff through sort of generic assumptions, the relative advantage is highly dependent on the individual situation and issues. As Paul said, if you have to borrow to do a direct purchase, I wouldn't do it. Financially, it doesn't look good. Is discounted or nominal more important to you? Most cities and counties in Iowa, I don't see a lot of discounting, but to some people that would be important. Whether you need to borrow is important. What I found making very generic assumptions is that a power purchase agreement and a direct ownership with a refundable tax credit in a generic situation, within rounding error, I'd say they're roughly the same. If you're discounting or you have to borrow, I would look at a PPA. Now, what you don't get is the immediate sexy, it's my solar up there. It's not your solar, it's somebody else's solar. But I would look at it, model your situation carefully, but don't rule it out would be my suggestion. And now we're back to Paul. Oh, yeah.
You can hear me? I think we're good. Okay. So specifically, what does the Inflation Reduction Act offer in terms of tax incentives for solar? So we've talked about the 30%, what we call the base credit. So if you were to do a project, there's no dollar cap associated with the 30% base credit. It's going to be valid for the next 10 years. And essentially, you're going to apply for reimbursement, which is going to likely happen at tax time. The IRS has not issued the final guidance on what form you're going to use, but what we think it's going to be is like when you file your taxes, or if you were to file your taxes as a non-taxable entity at tax time, you'd then receive a check for that 30% back. It's non-competitive, meaning there's not a program dollar amount associated with it. In addition to that 30% base credit, there are a series of what we call adders. Those adders are either 10 or 20%. The IRS has issued guidance on some of the adders. Some of them, as we go through this real briefly here, you may say, oh, that really applies to my situation, or no, it does not apply to me at all. Oftentimes, think of yourself as a developer or potentially as a community. Those are the situations in which you might be able to take advantage of some of these adders. So in theory, you could be able to receive up to 70% back. You can stack the adders such that you have the 30% base credit and you can add 40% onto that. So you'd essentially receive payment for 70% of the project cost if you were to be able to take advantage of all of those adders. Now, the adders are not automatic like the base credit. There's a certain national production cap associated with each of them on a yearly basis. And from my understanding, they're going to phase out when and if nationwide the electricity grid I believe it becomes 75% renewable, however that's defined. So they should be valid for 10 years, but in order to qualify for adders, you have to apply for them. It's a competitive process. You may not get them, and there's annual production quotas associated with each of them. So the first category of credits, now there are 4 of them. You could, in theory, apply and receive up to 1 of them from this list of 4. So the 4 are the low-income community, the tribal lands, the low-income residential project, and the low-income economic benefit project. Now, these are very vague. We don't understand exactly what the rules are for all of them, but generally speaking, the low-income credit, which is going to get you another 10% in addition to that 30%, is going to happen. The project would be installed in a census tract where the household poverty rate is at least 20%, or where median household income doesn't exceed 80% of the statewide median income. So if you can build your project in that census tract, you may be eligible for an additional 10%. Tribal lands, explanatory. Low-income residential projects. So these are for multifamily residential housing classified under the National Housing Act. So if you have like a subscription model where potentially tenants are eligible to essentially subscribe to a solar array, that may be a situation. This adder is going to be valid for 20%. And then finally, the low income economic benefit project, where at least 50% of the financial benefits of the electricity being produced is going to be provided to low income households. So you may be eligible for one of these 4 riders. The other 2 riders, then you can receive both of these in addition to one from the previous list of 4. So the first one on here is what we call an energy community, which is valid for 10%. So that's a project either built on a brownfield site or on a coal mine site or coal power plant site that closed after the end of the year of 1999. Or a census tract that has a significant employment or local tax revenue associated with the extraction, processing, transport, or storage of coal, oil, or natural gas. So that's a 10% credit in addition. And then finally, the last one, the domestic content, if you can demonstrate that all the material used in that project meets certain sourcing requirements, you may be eligible for another 10%. Now, we don't know. Some of these you think, okay, well, you know, there are no tribal lands around here. That doesn't apply to me. Some of these relate to communities, some relate to RECs, some relate to developers more than they do a small nonprofit, but there may be the potential to achieve a tax credit greater than the 30%. Questions about that portion of it? Yes. 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 So the question. So the question is, if net metering rules change in Iowa down the line, how does this all fit in? So if you have an existing contract with your utility, that contract is going to be honored. You would be grandfathered in that situation. But yeah, definitely net metering kind of is the foundation of a lot of this. For certain situations, if you have a high load that's continually running, you may be able to size your solar system such that none of it is ever exported back out onto the grid. Net metering then would be kind of irrelevant to you. If you were to size your system such that it's small enough so that you're not exporting power back out onto the grid, that might be a situation for you. So just to recap that comment, Andy essentially said that solar or net metering in Iowa is going to be valid until at minimum 2026 or 2027, until Iowa reaches a solar penetration of about 5% as specified in the law. So if you can get your project completed before that date, you would be grandfathered in. That is outside of my wheelhouse. I don't know how REAP grant, I'm not sure how that, what you as a developer would be eligible for through the, I honestly, Jolene, I can't speak to that. Andy may be able to.
Advantage of REAP grants, but it's pretty complicated. So by and large, if you're interested in applying directly for that direct pay tax credit, you can't apply directly for a REAP grant. That helps.
Yes. No, it's the tax credit is valid for, yeah, original installations. Yep. No, I was solar tax credit is done. Yep. Yep.
Important point, if you were on the waiting list, you will get paid. We were all involved in that political struggle and they finally did pass a full backfill. So if you were on the waiting list, be sure that you're in touch with the IRS and you get that credit. If you never got yourself on the waiting list, no chance.
Can I finish this one slide and then we'll do Q&A? Is that good? Okay. And I just want to very briefly touch on this. This is kind of an appendage to our whole conversation here. But that is the commercial clean vehicle tax credit. Like the solar tax credit, it is refundable to non-taxable entities. Essentially, the value of it is 30% up to $7,500. So that applies to pure EVs. So if you got a standard EV, it also applies to plug-in hybrids that have a battery of 7 kilowatts or greater. Most plug-in hybrids have a battery of 7 kilowatts or greater. And unlike the personal EV tax credit that got kind of muddled with the IRA, so on the personal side of things, there are battery sourcing and mineral sourcing rules that govern how big that tax credit is going to be for you. Some models and some makers of vehicles currently are ineligible or will be ineligible for that tax credit here shortly. Those material and battery sourcing rules do not apply to the commercial EV tax credit. Just so long as it has the adequate size battery, you would be good. And then in addition to the $7,500 up to $7,500 tax credit, there's also a 30% up to $1,000 tax credit that's refundable for non-taxable entities for EV charging infrastructure. Q&A, yeah.
I just wanted to add something about another way for cities and counties and nonprofits with land to access solar. And that's that, at least in Alliant service area, Alliant has a community sited solar arrangement. they lease land from you to put solar on. You don't have anything to do with the solar. It's not a PPA. It's not a purchase. They're leasing the land from you, but the lease option that they're doing is $4,000 an acre for 25 years. So if you're a city with some land and it has to be, you know, near a transmission line and stuff like that, but that's a pretty darn attractive option. Again, it has nothing to do with solar in the sense that you don't get power or anything, you get money. And money is good.
The name of that program is the Customer Hosted Renewables Program.
Right.
Yep.
And it's on their website, but they don't talk about it a lot. I found it kind of by accident. Sorry.
Other questions? Yeah. I don't, the question is, do you have to have multiple bids, multiple contractors? I do not believe so. If you look at market prices for solar, are the prices at which contractors are coming in here locally tend to be quite low, even if you were to go to a regional city in Iowa. I can't, I don't know, I'm guessing, but I can't imagine, just given that there's so much variation in cost between markets.
It's a good question and point though, because it's another benefit of the direct pay. If you're a non-taxable entity and you can get those tax benefits directly, it makes it a little easier to issue. An RFP is easier to issue for outright ownership for contractors. Tell us what it would cost to install 10 or 100 kW of solar versus RFPs for PPA arrangements. They're more complicated. So it actually is just a simpler process to go out for a bid when you're looking at direct pay and outright ownership. Would you agree with that, Paul?
Yeah.
Uses electricity.
Yep. It does not matter. So what the end usage is does not matter. It doesn't matter when that usage happens. So if you're a campground and you know all 95% of your electric usage happens from April to the end of September, it doesn't matter because you're able to net meter that solar over the course of the whole year and receive credit for what you produce. So no, it doesn't matter. Just so long as you have the rate to sustain it and you're not a customer subject to demand charges, essentially. Yep. What's that?
So if anyone joining us online has questions, feel free to type your questions into the chat and I will read them out.
Yeah. That should be retroactive. So as a PPA developer, what would you be eligible for? I believe it's retroactive to the first of the year. So on the personal side of thing, the tax credit was restored to January 1st, 2022. As it relates to the business side of things, I'm not sure. I believe it's January 1st, 2023, but I may be wrong on that. I know on the personal side of things, if you installed the system at any point last year, you'd be eligible for the 30%, not just the 26% we were at. But I may be wrong, but I think it's, no, I'm not sure about that.
If you have an existing.
Yep. So expansions to existing systems would be eligible. Heidi. First for wind, do you know, Andy? Not on heat pumps though. Battery storage, wind, because the efficiency tax credits are separate from the renewable tax credits. And I'm not sure how the adders fit in. I think the adders may be solar specific. I'm not sure. I'm not entirely sure on that.
Rewiring your entire building.
No.
Anything else?
Craig's
Heidi?
asking, I'm told nonprofit low-income housing agencies like HACAP can't access direct payments, but renters can. How could such an agency structure a program to let renters install solar?
Or that the housing agencies, if they're nonprofits, that they can't access. I think you might need to double check that. Because a wide variety of nonprofits, non-taxable entities, and local governments, including all, as far as we understand, subsidiaries and quasi-governmental organizations and governmentally supported organizations are. So not positive, Craig, but I think you still may be eligible. In terms of if not, and allowing renters to be eligible, that's, I don't know, really difficult because renters, you have to be an owner of the system to do that. So maybe a wonderful tax advisor can figure it out. You know?
And
Well,
that's where
Andy?
if we could get PACE, property assessed clean energy. If we could get PACE, that would solve the problem, but I don't think that problem is nearly solved.
Okay. Andy, I was talking to the City of Iowa City sustainability person. She's been researching this and was very surprised to find that the Community Action Agency, a low-income housing developer, cannot use the tax credits, but that the renters could. And so you would need to devise a system where the agency
Okay.
could.
We should also
subsidize the
mention that,
renters.
of course, direct pay is for owners, outright owners. Alliant does have a community solar program now. It came out of the last rate case. It's technically open. You can go find it. Alliant Community Solar online. You can sign up. They will take your money. They won't give you any power yet because it's not built in online, or maybe it's being built right now this spring. But that is an option for folks that don't have on-site availability. And this is open to both residential and business customers. The terms are not as good as outright ownership, generally speaking, but they're not awful. They will not qualify you for tax credits because you're not an owner. Alliant is the owner of the system, but it's an option. It's an opportunity. So community solar continues to get brought up repeatedly, and there's now a program that will be opening this year that you'll be able to get bill credits for. So just wanted to not forget to mention that.
And one final question here from Jim online. He says, are you sure that you have to wait until the relevant tax season to claim the direct payment? When the ITC was converted to a cash grant, applicants so this was like about a decade ago, applicants just sent their check info to the US Treasury and they got a check about 45 days later. That is a very good question. All of this entire conversation is premised on the IRS guidance that's yet to be issued, which is hopefully going to happen here. We postponed this event to March because we assumed it was going to be issued by now. It still has not been issued, but from everything that we've read online says that everyone is under the assumption that it's going to happen at tax time, not just randomly as you bring your projects online. But that's a question to be worked out. To stick to an hour, I think we're going to hold it at that. Thank you very much, everyone. We have our work cut out for us to ensure that we have good audio between the in-person crowd and those online. Sorry, those of you online, if that was a bit frustrating trying to catch the questions. But thanks for coming, and we will see you next month with a topic to be determined. Thanks.
Thank you.